We're going to get started. I'm so glad you guys are here. I know it's a tough week. It's a vacation week, so I'm glad we have more than a quorum. So first, let me introduce a little bio of our speaker. Ira Bedzow is an assistant professor of medicine and director of the Biomedical Ethics and Humanities program here. His responsibilities include teaching the first and second year biomedical ethics courses, which introduce ethical principles and examine the moral basis of decision making and self-understanding in medicine with complex case studies. He is also developing a new master's program in biomedical ethics at New York Med. Dr. Bedzow received his PhD in religion from Emory University, an MA in Jewish Studies from Touro College, an MA in Humanities from the University of Chicago, and a BA in Political Science from Princeton. Dr. Bedzow is editor-in-chief of the quarterly journal En Route. He's also a senior scholar at the Aspen Center for Social Values, a network of socially minded individuals whose mission is to leverage the unique assets of the Jewish tradition to promote serious thought about and to bring a fresh and unique voice to social and societal challenges that confront the world today. He's the author of 6 books, numerous articles and chapters on Jewish law and philosophy and poetry. Welcome.
Sal, thank you very much for introducing me. I actually had no idea who you were talking about until you called my name. I was like, oh, wow. Hold on. So, first off, thank you everyone for coming. I know Sally also thanked you, and I know what the weather's like outside, so I really appreciate everyone being here. We're going to talk about cultural competency, language barriers, and medical error. The way it's going to work is I'm going to set up first an introductory video. The introductory video will, give you the perspective from the patient side, in particular from refugees who have limited English proficiency. Then we'll go through what the law regarding medical interpreters and translators is. We'll go through the facts regarding their use. We'll give examples of why they're important. Then we'll have a closing video, and the closing video will be from someone on the medical side, who recognizes this because he also has English as his second language, and then we'll take questions.
Translation in doctor's offices and hospitals. Zuleika Wajo is from Ethiopia. She came to San Diego by way of Oregon.
So a lot of people that are afraid of, frustrations and worry too much what's going to happen, what's who's going to say. Because of not understanding, we worry, are you going to help me or are you going to go down to me? Because we're really comfortable with what he says, what he's going to do.
Wajo said refugees often put off going to the doctor because they feel it will make things worse. Some of the women report getting a wrong medication, a misdiagnosis, even a wrong surgery because they can't communicate with their doctor. Wajo said she recently went to the doctor to have a persistent rash looked at. She got it 6 years ago. Wajo and Nor helped interview more than 200 refugee women with similar stories earlier this year.
So those of you who took part in this study, can you raise your hand?
Researcher Bill Oswald helped with the study.
2/3 of the women generally said that they have no idea what their doctor is telling them. They have no faith the doctor understands them. They don't know what to do when they get their aftercare, and they have very little awareness of what the medicine is supposed to do or how they're supposed to take it.
The state offers translated prescription labels for free online. It also passed laws requiring that all providers be culturally competent and never rely on children to translate for their parents. But a slapdash approach to translation is the status quo. Most often, family and friends are pulled in to do the work. Prescriptions are rarely translated. In San Diego, the La Maestra Clinic on Fairmont Avenue is a model because it hires from the refugee community. But still, those employees have to serve multiple roles because the clinic can't bill insurance companies for translation alone. La Maestra also has to refer patients to specialists in hospitals where translation isn't readily available.
Most doctors' offices provide translation over the phone, and refugee patients cite one major problem with that: the translators can't see them. This group provides a solution.
It's set up with an exam table, a camera, and a big screen TV that can connect with other doctors' offices. Patients and their La Maestra interpreters can meet with a specialist remotely. Zara Marcellian is the founder and CEO of La Maestra. She said telemedicine is the only way she'll permit translation over the phone. She says the phone service specialists and hospitals use doesn't go far enough.
They don't have any background information. What's happening here, California, in terms of what program they could qualify for if they get into those kinds of conversations or translating those issues. They won't know. They won't know where to hook the patient up to or where to send them for help because they're outside the city, outside the state. So to me, it just is like it's getting the job maybe a quarter done.
Wacho agrees.
When you interpret the interpreter to include our interests face-to-face, as well as a phone. We don't want anyone to be bitter.
The women will send their petition to the board handling California's new health exchange under the Affordable Care Act. The board is tasked with setting regulations for participating insurance companies. In the meantime, Nora says she sees one glimmer of hope. Second-generation refugees are studying medicine, including her own daughter, who recently graduated from UCSD. Megan Burks, KPBS News. When Zahara Moore
So what I found interesting when I was first starting to look at this was, a lot of times in medical ethics we talk about cultural competence. And we look at cultural competence in one of the following ways. We either see it as we have a normative culture and we have to accommodate those people from other cultures in order to understand where they're coming from, in order to treat them better. Or we see it in terms of maybe similar but a little bit different in terms of society composes, or culture is composed of a compromise of many different cultures. All of those cultures having different perspectives, different worldviews, which means that the way I speak to someone, even if we're using the same language, may at times be understood differently. That being said, when we think about language barriers, we think about it in terms of a means of communication, meaning if only I understood what they were saying, or if only they understood what I was saying, we wouldn't have this problem of miscommunication. It doesn't necessarily transfer into cultural competence. However, the idea of language being tied to the way we think about the world, or the way we understand illness and disease, or the way we understand what it is to be a patient in our relationship with a physician, is very much tied to culture. So much so, in fact, that when you look at the law about how the obligation to use medical interpreters develop, it's very clear that language is a consequence of culture, or a relationship with culture, and not something that's separate. For example, today, medical interpreters and translators must be provided by law for both physical and mental health care. And having those translators is not just a matter of communication, it's a protection against discrimination on national origin. The development of this legal obligation actually starts with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, where it said that no person in the United States shall, on grounds of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Now, when I first read that, and please, if you have a different way, when I first read that, it just seemed to be against racism, right? It didn't seem to be a matter of, oh, well, culture obviously would connote a language barrier which we have to take into consideration. It was, no, people, even within America, of a different race or color shouldn't be discriminated against. However, in interpreting this section of the Civil Rights Act, the Supreme Court treated discrimination based on language as equivalent to national origin discrimination. Furthermore, in 1980, as we go further down, the Department of Health and Human Services issued a notice stating that no person may be subjected to discrimination on the basis of national origin in health and human services programs because they have a primary language other than English. This statement also includes any institution that receives federal financial assistance, and we'll get to what that actually means. It's much broader than you would think in terms of just a government agency. In 2010, this was even further expanded, or let's say further reinforced, by President Clinton, who issued an executive order which was called Improving Access to Services for Persons with Limited English Proficiency. So here it's changing a little bit. It used to be in terms of race or national origin or culture. Now it's a matter of limited English proficiency, meaning if you don't speak English in the same way as a, let's say a born and bred American who speaks English, then you automatically might have a different culture that needs to be taken into consideration for fear of discrimination. So President Clinton issues this executive order, and he reiterates that the federal fund recipients must ensure that their own programs provide equal access to limited English proficiency individuals. President Bush, and the reason why I bring both Clinton and Bush, not only because it's historically relevant, but it also shows that regardless of which party one might aspire to join and lead one day, this is an issue that crossed boundaries. So under the Bush administration, the executive order was upheld, but furthermore, its policy guidance was revised and reissued. The guidance intended to assist recipients of federal funding in determining what, quote unquote, the reasonable steps to provide meaningful access to limited English proficiency persons are required to comply with Title VI, which is the Civil Rights Act, and existing regulations. Now, these recipients are any private or public, of any private institution or organization that operates, provides, or engages in health or social service programs, and receives federal financial assistance from the Department of Health and Human Services directly or through another recipient. What's important to note is once a healthcare provider accepts federal funds, then the provider is responsible for providing language access to all of its providers, not just for those who are coming under the benefit of those federal funds. That's a good question. Not here, with regards to this particular statement and guideline. With regards to school funding,
certainly the based clinic which are operating throughout the state.
Fine. Anything that has to do with health and healthcare would fall under this, and is what I put my topic.
And even though it doesn't affect national origin, certainly people who are born and bred in the United States, but perhaps speak Ebonics or the language of their parents and never learned English.
Right. So we're going to get to second generation, or let's say first generation Americans whose parents are from somewhere else, who speak two languages at home, or one language at home, how that applies also. But your comment is very poignant, especially to the point where language and culture are very much tied. And it's not a matter of English as a dominant culture, everyone should learn it. If you don't, then there's a access of racism or discrimination of Americans. It's a matter of there's a cultural discrimination. Language is one manifestation of that. Right? There was, and I didn't bring it because it's more social in nature, but there was an English-only political, let's say, program to push people to learn English or to use English as a dominant language. And it's funny, there was also a book by Samuel Huntington who wrote the book on the third wave, but he wrote in terms of becoming American, where he talks about the Mexicanization of America. And he's very much strong views, let's just say. He has strong views on that in terms of what does that mean in terms of the American culture, not necessarily in terms of just the language that's being spoken in the country.
Was this for client or employee?
In terms of clients or employees, in terms of who receive care, or in terms of who are giving care?
An institution that receives federal funds, okay, that wants to hire somebody. Somebody may have two people that are qualified. Okay, one communicates well, the other doesn't communicate well. Or let's say the person who does not communicate well might even have better qualifications. Right? This law is that institution bound to hiring a person that does not communicate but also hire an interpreter that will serve to interpret.
Right, so if the question was, you have these two, and you wanted to give them health services, medical services, but in terms of employment contracts, once again, that isn't part of the talk that I'm giving. And once again, I'm also not a legal scholar in terms of how that would work. We will get into some of the exemptions and how that would work with regards to undue burden and financial burden, which one might say could carry on in larger issues than just the healthcare issues. But I'm not going to be able to say with any definitive. This is related to patients or who receive healthcare. Yeah. So in examining the compliance on it's not like a strict matter. They look at it a case-by-case basis, and we'll see from these 4 factors why. The Office of Civil Services examines these factors to determine if the reasonable steps are actually being taken. So the way they look at it is, what is the number or proportion of limited English proficiency patients that are expected to be encountered? Meaning, the expectation in, let's say, Montana might be different than in Miami in terms of how many translators you might need, or if you might need a translator or not. The frequency with which limited English proficiency individuals will come into contact with the provider, the nature and importance of the service, which already we're getting to be a little bit more subjective, if you notice, and the resources available to the provider and its costs. Now, the importance of looking at the resources available means that smaller recipients with more limited budgets are not expected to provide the same level of language services as larger recipients with larger budgets, even in the same location. It's not just a matter of they're in different locations, so therefore they have different expectations. Large entities, and those entities serving a significant number or proportion of limited English proficient persons, should ensure that their resource limitations are well substantiated before using this factor as a reason to limit language assistance. This is also really important, because while the guidance says that you have to make sure your limitations are well substantiated, the onus is actually going to be on the plaintiff to show that it was not an undue burden to have a translator. If, for example, if the service provider says it is too expensive, it's not financially feasible in any capacity to be able to provide a translator, that's going to take the presumption, not, well, you should have one, now you have to prove it was an undue burden. Right? So furthermore, there's, besides in how they look at compliance is reasonable, how to comply itself is also a series of factors. So there's 4 methods. One could be hiring bilingual staff. The second is hiring an interpreter, someone who isn't necessarily on the medical staff, but is part of the hospital who just acts as an interpreter. The other is contracting with outside interpreter services, such as community volunteers. And the one which was mentioned in the YouTube video, although it was a little bit more sophisticated, was arranging for the use of telephone language interpreter services. Now, the use of the telephone is not as satisfactory as the other 3, and can't be offered unless there's no other available option. Now, we can understand the reason of why that would be the case. Talk to someone in person and talk to someone on the telephone, you're going to have a very different view of what's going on between those 2 media. Right? However, if it's the only option you have, it's the only option you have.
Well, it also seems like it would be unrealistic to not use it in a city like I just came from, Tampa, where it's not a question of 2 languages, it's a question of 18. Mm-hmm. And you simply can't arrange, you couldn't, or in Sacramento where I'm in, there were simply so many language groups that arranging appropriate interpreters was simply beyond the scope of even a big hospital. So we had to be very creative as to how to reach language competency for all the different groups we had coming in. So I think this was really set up thinking of more bilingual, in fact, interesting to use the term bilingual model there. And I'm not sure how realistic that standard is given the way America is going with such an incredibly diverse language groups in the country.
No, you're absolutely right. There's actually been a big push recently, if you look at law review articles and you look at patient advocacy group memoranda about the use of the telephone should be much greater. Not only because of the variety of languages the hospital has to deal with, but the cost of having someone on the telephone versus someone on the on staff is great. Not only that, interestingly, people are also starting to push things like translator apps, like Google Translate and so forth, which allows for the semantics in the terms of translation to work to some extent, and you still have that face-to-face dynamic to understand body language and maybe the connotations. So with regards to people who are bilingual, and I say this because medical Spanish is becoming a very popular course, people who are bilingual are able to conduct business in the workplace in either of those languages. They're not people who are proficient in one language. They're not people who can say, "Hi, I'm your doctor," but nothing else. You have to actually be able to communicate fully in those two languages in order to be able to translate from one to the other. Not to say that medical Spanish is not important, but it's necessary but not sufficient. Let's put it that way. So some of the reasons why the bilingual aspect is really important, and not just the proficiency aspect can be acceptable, is forget the fact that different regional dialects occur. That you may have one understanding one language in, let's say, Cuba versus Puerto Rico in certain types of terms. The languages can also have false cognates that are not recognized by people unless they're fully immersed in both languages. And I'll give you the example of Willie Ramirez. Does anyone know this case of Willie Ramirez? It's kind of like the case that comes up a lot. It happened a while ago, in 1980, but I'll give the case because it comes from South Florida, which I know there's a number of people here who are from South Florida and wish to go back there one day when they retire. So, in 1980, Willie Ramirez was taken by an ambulance to a South Florida hospital in a comatose state. He became a quadriplegic as a result of a misdiagnosed intracerebral hemorrhage that continued to bleed for more than 2 days as he lay unconscious in the hospital. In the course of the lawsuit, it was asserted that Willie could have walked out of the hospital had the neurosurgeon been called earlier. However, no neuroconsult was ordered for 2 days because the emergency room physician and the doctor covering Willie in the ICU erroneously believed that Willie had suffered from an intentional drug overdose, and they treated him accordingly. The misdiagnosis was based on the physical exam, which initially pointed to a drug overdose, and on the complete confusion regarding the medical history. At the heart of this confusion was that the Spanish word that was continuously used for Willie was intoxicado, which we would think means intoxicated. It doesn't mean intoxicated. Among the Cuban population in South Florida, intoxicado actually is an all-encompassing word meaning you're nauseated from eating something, or you feel sick from something that you ate. Turns out he ate like at McDonald's or something like that. It had nothing to do with what was going on. But he ate at McDonald's. He wasn't feeling very well. It got worse and worse over the night. They took him to the hospital. His mother kept saying intoxicado, intoxicado, and thinking that it was McDonald's, obviously. And they said, "Oh, he's intoxicated. Let's just treat him for a drug overdose." So other examples of false cognates that can endanger health, and these happen also, is embarazada doesn't mean I'm embarrassed. It would actually be, I don't want to say funny because that would be inappropriate, but like if one were on a sitcom and saw someone saying, "Oh, thank you for coming, I'm your doctor. Oh, you're embarrassed, I'm so sorry, like I'll step out." No, it means that she's pregnant. It's a very different translation than one would think if one thought it was just a pure cognate. The other, and this is a case that happened as well, was a clinician communicated in French to a Haitian patient who spoke only Creole. But being from Haiti, the clinician thought that the person spoke French and said something about his l'estomac coming in pain of some sort. So in French, estómac means your stomach, but in Creole it actually means your chest. So they examined the wrong part of the person's body just through a pure mistranslation. So, furthermore, the need for a bilingual staff or experienced medical interpreters, not medical interpreters who might have just finished 4 years of Spanish in high school, or let's say took French in college and then decided to go to France for the year and now speaks French fluently, is demonstrated actually by this following study. So in 2012, there was a study that analyzed audio recordings from visits at 2 large pediatric emergency departments in Massachusetts. What these researchers found, was that thousands of what they deemed interpretation mistakes, even among the professional interpreters, These included omitting, adding, substituting words, adding their own perspectives, using idioms, words or phrases that didn't exist in the patient's language. Of these, 18% had potential clinical consequences. What was interesting, though, is if they had more than at least 100 hours of training, you saw a dramatic decrease in these types of errors. Right? You could see this in any aspect of translating life. Like, there's a lot of times. So I had an uncle who only spoke Yiddish. It was, towards the end of his life, he forgot all of his English, and we used to just make up what he said. I mean, not that we were completely oblivious of what he said, but there comes a point where when you're talking fast in a conversation, or you want this or you want that, you just kind of know, or you think you know what is going on when you don't actually listen to what the person's saying. So in high-stress situations, a lot of times, interpreters can make that mistake in anticipating an issue that actually doesn't come about. So let's move on. Let's talk about the facts regarding the use of translation services. So the fact of the matter is, many healthcare providers don't use adequate interpreter services. And they don't do so because of that financial burden that it imposes, which we talked about, that undue burden issue, factor number 4. And you can see in this study that was in 2013, where most pediatricians said they would use a bilingual family member, which you would think is okay. We can get into the reasons why it's preferred not to use a family member. Although the proportion reporting that technique fell from 70 to 57% between 2004 and 2010, which you think is great. However, the proportion of doctors using formal interpreters grew from 50% to 56% over the same period, right, which I guess is great relative to where you want to set your marks. The reason why it causes such a huge financial burden is, one, Medicare doesn't pay for interpretation services. Either does insurance, as we saw from the YouTube. In 13 states in the District of Columbia, they do directly reimburse, although not completely, for language services used in Medicaid and Children's Health Insurance programs. And I'm going to give you an example of what happens when Medicaid doesn't reimburse. So if you have a patient in this situation, in California where they don't pay for language services, you may get $20 for the physician office visit. But if the person is someone who doesn't speak English and you have to hire an interpreter, that interpreter may cost $150 to $200. And that doesn't get charged to the patient. It doesn't get charged to insurance. It has to be considered an operating cost or a business cost or a business expense for the institution itself.
What does that mean?
They lose money.
And the physician from Medicaid gets $7 for the visit.
Well, no, let's say the physician, yeah, so they get 20, they lose 150.
The physician himself or herself, they get $7 for the visit. That's what he's down there, New York, okay. For Medicaid, they get $7. If they needed to absorb $20, they can't make it up on borrowing.
No. So one of the reasons why it's such a difficulty for to use the translation services, and the YouTube video actually happened for a group. That group took place in California, and the reason why they're pushing insurance to pay for it is because it's just, we don't treat patients for the money, but if we can't afford to work because there is no money in treating patients, it becomes very difficult. So that's where this cycle of difficulty comes in. It costs more money to treat patients than it does to not treat the patients. Other reasons, besides just the financial burden, is that there's time pressure, there's a lack of knowledge about availability, and there's procedural difficulties. And we can all imagine what types of time pressure and procedural difficulties in a high-stress situation would be. So even though the law demands that one must have a medical interpreter when dealing with limited English proficiency patients, and the facts are that many don't use interpreters, you would think that, well, there should be a lot of, let's say a lot of lawsuits from patients who are getting inadequate care. There's not. And the reason why there's not, besides the fact that the onus is on the plaintiff, is that many people with LEP patients who are either refugees or immigrants will be unfamiliar with the legal system. They may not find an attorney who can accommodate their language needs, or who's willing to take their case. And there may be intimidation due to being an immigrant in terms of social marginalization. So let's talk about examples of, yes?
Why is it not discrimination on the part of the attorney simply not to take the case because of language barrier? Because they doesn't take that from.
So,
He's not delivering
right.
healthcare, which is delivering
Right. And also a lot of times, like, for example, also with regards to the patient-physician relationship, you're not obligated, as a private physician, you're not obligated to take any patient who comes into your office, right? The relationship is voluntary both ways, as long as you show that you're not doing it based on race, color, language.
I have to tell you, I work in this management, there's no barrier. A lot of illegal aliens are also in the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
There are plenty of patients who really don't speak English, know how to get to their attorney's office.
Mm-hmm.
So there's,
Well, they go to the attorney first. Decide which guy to go.
No, they arrive at Kennedy and then go from Kennedy to the emergency room. And when they get discharged, they go to the lawyer.
yeah, they know the system.
Well, I will tell you, this is a,
Can I just say?
Yeah, please, of
can I
course.
just chime in here? You know, one of the reasons why there may not be that many lawsuits is that when there are providers that are willing to care for this segment of population, they know that these providers are dedicated and committed to these people, and they don't want to sue them because they know that they're doing a great service. And so sometimes the care may not be perfect, but they
So much more idealism that does not happen.
No, it doesn't happen, it happens when you die.
Even the legal lawsuits know that.
right. Also, I don't think it's homogeneous across the country. Like in certain areas where the immigrant population is, let's say, much denser, then there might be a higher rate of lawsuits. In other places where the culture might be different in terms of the relationship that immigrants might have, lawsuits might be a lot less. Right? You can't say across the board it's always the same.
right.
No,
And-
I'm
and
not
when
saying
there's
that, but I'm saying it's not a barrier. And I've had plenty of physicians who give me thank you notes from their patients who have, that they're getting sued by the same patient. So,
Regardless, let's talk about examples of why translation services are important. So, and again, I'm not speaking about every single physician who is working with this type of population in a caring and idealistic manner. I'm looking more in terms of the general trends. With regards to the general trends, people who have limited English proficiency are less likely to have a regular source of primary care and less likely to receive preventative care. They're less satisfied with the care that they do receive, maybe why now the suing is going up, and they're more likely to report overall problems with care and maybe an increased risk of medical error. The language barriers lead to inefficient care because clinicians are unable to elicit their symptoms, and thus they use more diagnostic resources or invasive procedures. And I'll give three examples of three different cases where there's a detriment to language barriers and barriers imposed on patients. So the first one has to do with when patients don't always give complete information. So in this case, it was a 56-year-old Filipino patient who had an allergic reaction to the medication Toradol, which is prescribed for kidney stones. Patients known to be allergic to Motrin are not given Toradol, and the emergency medical technician report stated that the patient was allergic to Motrin. However, the emergency room physician failed to read the patient's allergy in the report. The patient did not expressly inform to the emergency room physician, who wrote in the medical chart that the patient denied any allergy at this time. During the lawsuit, he said that if the patient had disclosed to him that she was allergic to Motrin, he would not have ordered Toradol, obviously. He argued that the patient was responsible for not disclosing her allergy directly to the physician. Notably, the emergency room's physician's notes recognized that his ability to take a complete and accurate history and physical was limited by the language barrier. This case was thrown out. Let's say it wasn't thrown out. It was settled due to lack of any type of ability for the patient to win. So all that the doctor really and medical care providers had to pay was legal fees. However, it shows that the fact that even though the patient said that, or at least the EMT knew that the patient was allergic, but the patient didn't say anything, it was her fault. At least in this case, it was her fault that she received improper medication. So the other is improper communication could lead to a misdiagnosis. In this case, a 7-year-old boy's father and grandparents brought him to a pediatrician a number of times over the span of several weeks. The father spoke very little English and had very little formal education. Both grandparents spoke only Spanish, and during the court, they actually required a court interpreter. The child presented with a fever and a sore throat, which the pediatrician misdiagnosed as strep. The misdiagnosis delayed the correct diagnosis of Kawasaki's disease, which resulted in the child's damage to the child's organs. Based on the lack of documentation in the medical records, the pediatrician did not use an interpreter to communicate with his father or grandparents, indicating an inability to take a proper patient history. So here, again, the misdiagnosis was due to the fact that the communication wasn't there, not necessarily because the physical was wrong or the medical reasoning based on the facts that he had was wholly wrong. It was based on the fact that there was incomplete information. Interestingly enough, though, this issue is not only a case, not only coming up between an English-speaking doctor and immigrant patients. Today, in our multicultural environment, where we have physicians and patients from all over the place, you actually see this language barrier occurring when neither patient nor physician speaks English so well. And I'll give this one example. There was a Thai woman who sued her endocrinologist, alleging that his delay in correctly diagnosing her caused its advancement to become a cancerous blockage of her lymph nodes. The endocrinologist graduated from medical school in China, and according to the case file, spoke only broken English, making him often difficult to understand. Although the woman and her husband and sons spoke some English, Thai was their primary language. So here, this case illustrates how ineffective communication results when both may speak English, but both speak English as a second language. So, just gonna. All right. So besides the difficulty in communication that exists, you actually have.
Emergency room, or is it
So I don't have all of the facts of this case in particular.
there should be some doctor selection. You go to a doctor with good, who's competent, whether it's a doctor who's personal, or a doctor who speaks language.
Look, I understand where you're coming from. But
you don't know that.
they don't give me all of the facts. Like when I read the case, I didn't look at the situation in terms of, or they don't give the information in terms of why they chose that particular doctor. But I think you could think of many reasons why someone would go to a doctor, whether they're recommended to that doctor, it's the only doctor available to them, it's the only doctor that might accept their insurance, it might be the only doctor that would take them regardless. There's many reasons why you may be stuck with a doctor that's not necessarily ideal for you. But besides the medical area, you actually can get into a legal issue with regards to obtaining informed consent. So this was from a case which I just thought was really great when they talk about informed consent, because part of the aspects of part of the factors of informed consent is explaining to the patient the various alternatives, the various treatment alternatives. So here is where the court talks about explanation. It says, explanation implies more than a mere correct statement of facts. An explanation clarifies an issue, makes it understandable to the recipient, and almost by definition, takes into account the mental state and capabilities of the recipient. For example, a physician can mouth words to an infant, or to a comatose patient, or to a person who doesn't speak his or her language, but unless and until such patients are capable of understanding the physician's point, the physician cannot be said to have, quote, explained anything to any such person. Right? So, it's pretty self-explanatory, I mean, no pun intended. But you get this issue with regards to giving a general idea of talking to a patient in terms of what the treatments are in general, and then giving them an English consent form when they don't speak English. That becomes oftentimes difficult in terms of informed consent. So I also wanted to give you where the errors in medical interpretation occurs in pediatric encounters. Going back to why medical interpretation is so important. During a 7-month period, these people, this group transcribed 13 encounters in a hospital out-clinic patient in which a Spanish interpreter was used. Professional interpreters were present for 6 encounters, and ad hoc interpreters, which included nurses or social workers, or even an 11-year-old sibling, were used for the others. 306 interpreter errors were noted, with a mean of 31 per encounter. The most common type of error, again, which we saw before, was either omission, false fluency, substitution, editorialization, and addition. And in this situation, the difference between those errors being clinically relevant from a professional interpreter versus not was 77% of those were clinically relevant with an ad hoc interpreter, as opposed to 53% with a professional interpreter. So given the fact that professional medical interpreters are important, their need is also increasing. The Bureau of Labor Statistics predicted that by 2022, the employment opportunities for interpreters would rise for 46%. The reason is not only is the need now greater than the supply of interpreters, but it's only going to increase. Today, in our multilingual population, 18% of people speak English, another language besides English at home. Of that 18%, you can see 62% are in Spanish, 18% speak another European language, and 15% in Asian language. With regards to the multilingual population, as we said before, it's not straight across the board across the country. If you look, with that 18% in America, in California it's 44%, in New York it's 30%, which means all the more need for professional medical translators. Hold on one sec. So, within this multilingual population, the Hispanic population is the one that actually has the most problems, at least according to this presentation at the Cleveland Clinic. With regards to communicating with physicians, with regards to asking questions. So a lot of times, if you think you understand, but you don't really understand, you kind of or you don't want to ask too much for fear of betraying your own ignorance. So we have this situation also in terms of patients pretending they know what they're saying. The worst was with regards to, this is actually should be flipped, so it's actually 36%, of the Hispanic population said it was very difficult to understand prescription bottles. So this we've seen similarly. There's in a retrospective analysis from 1997, we.
Is that corrected? I mean, is that because of English or because they just can't read directions? No, seriously. Because I know, a lot of people we know can't read directions.
Right, so
is it a language issue?
So we'll see in the YouTube, including YouTube, he gives an example of the physician explaining how to take the medication in addition to the directions being on the bottle, and it still wasn't understood. A lot of times, there's the difference between take 1 for 7 days or 7 for 1 days in a language that you don't speak so well gets to be confusing. Or take 2 every 15 days and 15 for 2 days is that'd be much more difficult to swallow, literally.
And the chart right there shows it, right? That a certain percentage of, presumably white, presumably English speaking, can't understand the prescriptions on the bottle.
Correct. So
That can be due to education.
correct. That's right.
And a lot of Spanish.
So a proper empirical study would have been how many don't understand when the bottle has prescription labels in Spanish also.
Russian also.
Yeah.
So that could be the Russian, because we saw before it's 4% or 3%, it's slightly flat, 3% Russian. On the right side of the...
It could, but it also could.
On the right side of the...
Yeah, it should have been written in
Russian.
white, it should have been written English is a native language, you're really talking about language. But
Correct.
I bet that was referring to just general population. Look at how many of our patients can't understand what it means. The way they measure the pharmacy writes thrice instead of 3 times.
We're also trying to fit into a very small group.
So-
Abbreviation.
By the way, regardless, also, I mean, as you mentioned, the way we speak English in different parts of the country and through different socioeconomic classes also affects how you understand cross-culturally. So the way things are written on a prescription bottle might easily be misinterpreted by someone who is very unfamiliar or illiterate in terms of how to read a prescription bottle, even if we think that is something that would be foreign to us. I wanted to conclude before we went to the final YouTube video of, we know it's important, we got it, it's important to work with an interpreter, right? But that doesn't mean we know how to work with an interpreter, or what is the proper way to work with an interpreter. So here are a number of guidelines that we see for working with an interpreter in order to maintain a patient-physician relationship that is positive, effective, and beneficial. So of course I put first choose a trained interpreter, and even though we kept saying don't use family or friends because of either privacy issues or because of taking things for granted issues or any of the translation errors, there are some who say no, you should use family and friends, not necessarily for the linguistic aspects, but the cultural aspects. Because if you have a medical interpreter who is very familiar with the language, but not necessarily understands the culture of, like, you know, a person's, let's say, 80-year-old grandmother, maybe the granddaughter who, you know, is bilingual might be just a better cultural fit than just a linguistic fit. Yes?
I could just add, you know, on the admission side, as we identify candidates to enter the physician workforce, many of our applicants are first-generation Americans or immigrants themselves, and it's through our MMI scenarios. We have cultural competence where we ask questions about use of interpreters, and many have themselves served as interpreters for family and friends, and feel that this is a norm for them, while they may recognize, so they even enter the workforce with that bias, if you will, that needs to be perhaps corrected or, you know, kind of advanced once they come to medical school and understand the implications of what are the problems, potential problems. But that's just another layer in terms of the kind of the emerging workforce that's coming up the pipeline. That they feel comfortable serving as you know, the family member serving as an interpreter. They feel very comfortable with that because that's within their own personal experience. And so when they go into the room, you know, and serve as an intern or whatever, they feel comfortable using a family member. It's something that seems very natural to them. Okay? And yet we have to train them that there are these, you know, concerns about perhaps the bias that you get when you use a family member. It may be the only practical solution, nevertheless, I'm saying. But again, just offering that as food for thought.
I can also imagine the family member, perhaps the patient, initially feeling more comfortable with a family member translating for them, not understanding some of these other layers, but saying, well, I want to talk to a stranger. My family has been with me, so I'm more comfortable with this. And not saying, right, but I can see that the family member, the patient,
If you want to get censored information, just think of the scenario where you have a 13-year-old boy going in with a single mother, and you, as the doctor, want to ask the son, could you ask your mother how many sexual partners she has? So this is some, he may know, but he won't share that information.
No, okay, so,
What about the bigger picture that whenever somebody has, you know, a diagnosis of cancer, you're going to give them something serious, and we always tell them, bring a family member in. They tell patients in videos, if you're going to talk to the doctor to get a serious, bring a family member, bring a friend, because patients don't remember. They get so nervous when they're talking to a physician. So I'm not sure how bad it is to have except for that circumstance. And you always find them out and getting insurance.
They're not answering the question. There's the distinction, is that I think it's really highly variable either way, but I think that you have to be very sensitive because I think most of us wouldn't tolerate an English-speaking family member answering the questions for an English-speaking patient because we want to hear the patient's original voice if both speak English. all right? And I think the bias that's being referred to is that we have a presumption that we want to hear the patient's own words, own body language, own a way of approaching the problem. So I think the tough one is how to assess them in a given situation, whether the comfort factor outweighs the risk of the bias. And I'm not sure that just requires a lot of practice in doing it, because there's a lot of mistranslation and paraphrasing that goes on that may not reflect the true patient's expression. And I think
Maybe a family member trying to protect that. A family member.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so I will say, at the end of the day, look, nothing here is a hard, fast rule, because we like to make hard, fast rules. A lot of times, we can't comply with them. But it's going to be a factor of funding. How much money do you have to afford a translator? It's going to be a factor of privacy issues. Is it going to be a case where a family member is just not going to be the right person in terms of privacy? Is it going to be a matter of it would be important as a support group for that person to be there? There's a lot of things that go on. The reason why, at least in this literature, the trained interpreter, given some of the other factors, seem to be preferred, is because professionals oftentimes in situations like this have experience and are able to stay controlled in a very emotional, highly emotional situation, but a family member might not be able to. That being said, every case is going to be different. Here it's not rule application, it's analogical reasoning from one precedent to another.
It's just the opposite of what
Thank
that we
you.
don't want to hear from, you just saying you don't want to hear from a family member, you just saying you do not hear from the
Yeah, so I say,
maybe you should not hear from the patient. The patient should tell somebody else in English within the way to the English-speaking doctor.
right.
That's what's being
So I'm going to summarize and say, I think it really depends on the case and the patient and the family members that are involved. Sometimes we're going to contradict each other.
I'll give one more example. In Sacramento, we had a very tight-knit Hmong community where the translators, actually the interpreters, all knew all the patients from church, from other places. Interestingly, we got in exactly the opposite of what I just said, which was that the interpreter's so knowledgeable about these folks that we didn't feel we got an unbiased interpretation from the interpreter. Because they said, oh no, he always says that in church, don't listen to that. Translate what he actually said. So I think what I learned from that is that, as you suggested, are that hard and fast rules don't apply. You actually have to be incredibly sensitive to the given interpreter-patient interaction. Largely, I try to look at nonverbals from the patient. As the interpreter's translating and doing stuff, what are they looking like? Are they looking pained? Are they looking, are they comfortable in the situation? Where are they? But it's actually a tough one. It's one of the hardest things to teach students is how to assess that situation on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, well, this type of education is experiential education.
Yeah.
You can't read about this. I mean, you got to read about it and go to obviously all the lectures that I give.
But you can model standardized patients pretty well, and that's actually a couple of good sessions that we can develop.
Right.
How to actually model students doing interviews.
But regardless if you use a trained or a family member as an interpreter, it's important to recognize that language is a broader part of culture. So you should use the interpreter as a resource for cultural information. You don't want to throw an interpreter in there blind. You should orient them to know what they should be getting into in order to know what to expect when they're doing the interpretation. Remind the interpreter not to take, the reins in terms of what's being said. But really important is to remember that you're having the relationship with the patient and not with the interpreter. So you want to set up the dynamics such that the patient feels that they're the focus and not the interpreter. So you want to arrange the room in such a way that you can have eye contact, you can see nonverbal cues. They said it's better to seat the interpreter next to the patient because then you're still looking the same way no matter who you're looking at, as opposed to turning and so forth. You want the interpreter and the patient to have some trust because otherwise, I wouldn't tell a stranger, my deepest, darkest secrets, unless obviously I had a rapport with them. Then you want to address the patient directly. You want to keep your sentences short and simple. Even translators sometimes have a hard time repeating in a different language what you're saying when they know both languages really well. You want to verify mutual understanding because broken telephone always occurs, although we try to limit it as much as possible. And most importantly, you got to be patient. And I don't mean that like the patient. I mean like you have to have patience because you're in a situation here where it's very difficult to communicate, and oftentimes we get frustrated when we feel like we're not being heard or when we feel like we don't understand. So if we can be patient, it kind of reduces the tension in the room to allow for communication to occur better. So I want to give this last YouTube, only because I think he says it just so much better than I do, and I think it's just a really good close.
I've been a nurse for almost 23 years, and I did a lot of travel nursing for about 9 years in the past. And during my travel, a lot of people have asked me, where did you learn to speak English like this? And the fact is, I've been learning English since I was in first grade. I'm a naturalized citizen. I came here about 22 years ago. Can you tell me how many of you communicated with people who you would consider limited English proficiency? Show of hands. Quite a
You guys can raise your
few.
hands also.
What is the first thing they do to make you think or believe they understood what you said? Exactly. They shake their heads. Every day, millions of people like this go to healthcare institutions across the nation to get their healthcare needs. Imagine one of these folks going to the emergency department suffering from atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is a fast heart rate. He gets treated, the doctor prescribes him some Coumadin, go follow up with your physician, take this medicine. The nurse comes in, explains these 7 pills, you need to take them over 7 days. The guy goes home, he ends up taking the entire 7 pills in one setting and coming back with a brain hemorrhage. Why did this happen? It happens because people who are limited English proficiency might understand medical instructions different from people who are fully conversant in English. Now, most of the time, now this is a theoretical type of situation, still, does that happen? If you go to risk management cases, you'll probably see it does happen. Guess what the patient did when the nurse was explaining to him how to take his medication? What was he doing? Yes, he was shaking his head. Language barriers can be like asteroids. They hit and decimate the earth of patient safety. You know, it is programs like the Aligning Forces for Quality Speaking Together, Language Quality Improvement Collaborative, Hospital Quality Network. Those programs and initiatives really might have presented the foundation so these scenarios would not happen in real life. Now, over time, many people you will probably see across the day, there's so many researches about the damage that might happen from not providing medical interpreters. But I want to bring it in a little story. There's a renowned marketing story out there, it's probably over the internet, that talks about a company that wanted to sell shoes. So they sent 2 salesmen to the natives to sell shoes. The salesman went there for a week, they sent back 2 telegrams. The first telegram came in and said, no one wears shoes here, no opportunity, period. The second telegram came in, no one wears shoes here, lots of opportunity, period. Now, really, using medical interpreters in healthcare is like selling shoes. It requires the clever healthcare provider to understand the opportunity and realize and grasp that opportunity. Nelson Mandela said it best. He said, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in a language, in his own language, that goes to his heart. Thank you.
So there have been actually a lot of analyses about how there are ways to use medical interpretive services in a way that's cost effective and actually financially beneficial for different medical institutions. The idea of looking at this not as a problem but as an opportunity is a really great, not only perspective to have in general in life, but in this type of opportunity where the demand for medical translation is so great and ever increasing, to find new ways to not only mitigate but create opportunities for more effective patient care would be something that I think we should all not only look at and but respect those who are doing so as well. So thank you guys. If you guys have any questions or anything.
Ira, is there any literature on the use of FaceTime, Skype, face-to-face?
There is. It's funny. There's a big organization now called Hablamos Juntos that is really starting to do a lot of research on what the best ways to do it. I forget who they're funded by, but they're recognizing, especially in California, that this is a huge problem. And if they can jump out ahead of it now and find cost-effective ways of doing it, those medical institutions that adopt their views will be much more better. Like we'll be ahead of the game. So there is a lot of research out there on how this works and how it should work in the future. It's just a matter of finding the right databases to find them, which if you want, I can find them for you.
Well, that gets away from the problem of missing the non-verbals, which is the single biggest frustration of trying to do these things on the phone, having gone through that road in nephrology practice, is that when there's this triangulation and it's extremely difficult, even for an experienced practitioner, to keep track of the affect when you have one of the parties that's not visible to you. It's incredibly disorienting. Try it sometime. I actually tried that. It was actually when I was at UC Davis. It was actually very helpful to get the interpreter on an iPad. It wasn't very expensive. It actually worked really, really well. And I thought it made an enormous difference from the option, which was the phone when we did that. And it's actually not a big investment. It costs very much less. You don't have to buy hundreds of iPads. You just, the interpreter gets one, right? You get one in the clinic and you use that.
We
don't have to
lots of them around for each nursing station.
Exactly. So it's actually a minor issue. Yeah. It's actually a minor. It's not a minor thing. It ends up adding more resonance to the interpreter patient-doctor interaction. And I've been inclined to actually try it with students who are sometimes frustrated learning interviewing with interpreters to see how it works. But I think especially as patients enter a more electronic era where that's normal, I think that's the way we should go.
So it's funny. There's a couple of things, and then I'll leave it. One is the access to interpreters. The other is a standardization of interpreters, meaning, like, is there a certification that one needs in order to become a proper certified interpreter? They're actually starting to have certifications now in order to make sure that people are proficient and competent, because the last thing you want is someone who doesn't have all that experience and has the errors, which now you're paying $200 to have errors, like an hour. That doesn't make sense. You want to make sure that you have someone who's a professional. Did you have a question?
No, I just, this issue about family translation. I have strong reservations about that. I've been doing pediatric cardiology for quite a while. And there's an element of cultural censorship that occurs that you may not be aware of as a physician. The issue of cultural overlay is fascinating.